Hey, it's Carter from the KSBJ Morning Show, and so excited to dig deeper into faith and to be able to share our faith in a relevant way. It's always nerve-wracking of bringing up, yes, the most important thing, but also what can be a divisive thing in culture. And so excited that our guest today, Tim Barnett from Red Pen Logic and Stand to Reason. Bro, thank you. Your content is such an inspiration, and we appreciate you joining us.
That's awesome. Thanks for having me.
If you could, in an elevator pitch style, the gospel, you run into somebody, maybe it's even a stranger, and you're going to tell somebody about Jesus. What's the type of thing you would say?
Well, it may surprise you that I'm a little nervous about answering that kind of question, because I think there is a whole lot of obstacles that get in the way of presenting the simple gospel. Okay, the gospel is simple. Christ died for your sins, and I mean, there it is in a sentence. The problem is there's a whole lot of people who have questions about, hey, what does it mean to be a sinner? Or you go to share the simple gospel and they bring up things like, well, what about hell? How could a loving God send anyone to hell? Or what about science and faith? So they want to talk about evolution or something. You're thinking, I want to talk to you about Jesus, and you brought up evolution. Or they talk about hypocrisy in the church, or one of these obstacles. I call them gospticles. Okay, now don't look up that word. It's not a real word. Yeah. Okay, but it makes the point. There are obstacles to the gospel, obstacles to the faith. So it's not as easy as it was, say, 70 years ago to walk up to someone and present the simple gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. People have serious questions. Most people actually think they're a good person. When we walked up to the mall, the local mall, and just started asking people, are you a good person? I think 9 out of 10 people would say, yes, I'm a good person. And so they don't see the need for the gospel. By the way, gospel just means good news. Well, the good news only makes sense in light of the bad news. And so if they don't understand the bad news, you're not even going to get the ball rolling. And so oftentimes what I encourage people to do is to ask questions and put stones in people's shoe so they're prepared to receive the gospel in maybe that elevator setting at some point. One of the things we talk about at Stand to Reason is gardening and harvesting. Gardening and harvesting. In fact, in John chapter 4, Jesus is with the woman at the well, and he tells this woman all that she had ever done. She leaves, goes into town, and comes back with a whole bunch of people. And Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, you are going to reap where you didn't sow. What's he talking about? He's saying you're going to harvest where you didn't garden. This lady, this woman has done the gardening. She's got people thinking. She's got people coming out here, and now you're going to reap. And then he says, the reaper and the sower rejoice together. And so within Christianity, there are times where you are going to be a gardener. You're going to be responding to the challenges. You're going to be modeling the gospel, living it out. And then there will come a time, God willing, when that person is ready to be harvested. And that's when you're in the elevator and you kind of make that pitch. I just want you to know that God loves you. He loved you so much that he died for you, even while you were an enemy of his. And you see what happens. And at the end of the day, God's the one who's going to do the work in that situation. Okay. So maybe it's not a simple answer to the question of presenting the simple gospel, but I think in light of this, 21st century culture, we need to be able to respond accordingly, so we'll have the biggest impact.
So obviously the most convenient situation, I'll say, is you knowing somebody, you building a relationship. But when you do, and they're not somebody, like you said, we all think we're good people, how do you tell somebody in a loving way, you're a broken person?
That's a really good question. It helps certainly if you have a relationship with that person. But even if you don't, here's an approach that one might take. I think if you can ask a question instead of making a statement, it's a better way to approach a conversation. Why? Because questions are disarming. They show you're interested. And they're just a friendly way to interact. So in this case, I may say something like, do you believe that bad people deserve to be punished? So I'm talking with a stranger. Do you believe that bad people deserve to be punished? So I'm waiting for their answer. And likely they're going to say something like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, guilty people should be punished. A good judge would punish someone, would send someone to prison or whatever for committing a wrong or a bad deed. Okay, fair enough. I think the same thing, I might say. And then I have a second question. So the first question, do you believe that bad people should be punished? My second question is, have you ever done any bad things?
Yeah.
Have you ever done anything bad? And I would, by the way, say at that point, because I know I have, I've done lots of bad things. And I think if they're honest, they would admit they have. I mean, even if it's a small thing. Have you ever lied?
Sure.
Have you ever, taken something that wasn't yours? Have you ever, and you could just kind of go down the list. And then, so notice what just happened. I just asked two questions and I never said they were a sinner. I didn't even say they were broken. I asked them if they've ever done something wrong. And they're just giving me the honest response. And then I'm going to say, well, okay, if you have done bad things, that makes you, I'm going to now bring in some theological language. If you've done some wrong, some bad things, you're actually, the Bible describes that as sin, disobedience against God, and sinners deserve to be punished, as you've already, admitted. Okay, and then this is the part. So that's, by the way, that's all the bad news. That is all the bad news. Now I'm ready to offer the good news. Okay. Now that we've established we've both done some bad things, and because bad people deserve to be punished, this isn't good. Do you want a pardon? Do you want an offer of forgiveness? If I'm standing in front of the judge and the gavel's about to drop, and then the judge says, well, actually, there's a pardon available. Would either of you two like it? Of course, I'm going to jump up and say, yeah, pick me. I'd love that pardon. And that, by the way, is the gospel. That's the offer of forgiveness. God has done something on our behalf. He has taken our punishment on his behalf so that we can receive his righteousness and eternal life. So there's kind of my maybe it's the elevator, conversation where I'm going to ask 3 or 4 questions, get the person thinking, because I know deep down inside they are made by God. And so because they're an image bearer, there's a moral intuition within them. And that moral intuition actually tells all of us that we're guilty. And there's 2 responses to that. Some people suppress it, and we call that denial. Okay? I'm not really guilty. I'm a good person. Denial. The other response is to recognize that you are guilty and seek forgiveness. So all we're doing is trading on something I think deep down every human being knows, that they do fall short. Of course, that's what Scripture says.
That is so good when they have a basis of that there's a higher power at the very least. There's that phrase or technical category, I guess, moral therapeutic deism. There's something out there, and I should be a good person, and also I should, God or whatever it is should help me, and that's where a lot of culture is. But I want to get to more hostility questions later. But as for just right there of just somebody who doesn't even believe in a higher power, a lot of that might not work with somebody who's like, okay, well, cool. Yeah, I've done, I guess, bad things, but it doesn't matter in the long run because I think we're just dust after this. How do you go about that?
That's a really good question. What I want to do is show or expose an inconsistency in what they say and how they live. Because it's real easy to say, for example, that morality is relative. It doesn't really matter how you live. We're all going to go to the dust anyways. Like, there are people who are moral relativists. And that just means that they don't believe in an objective moral standard. And of course, Christians, we believe that standard is God's nature. They don't believe in that. Okay, fair enough. The problem is they can't live it, okay? They know it's wrong to commit certain kinds of actions. I actually was at a Catholic high school here in the Toronto area where I live, and I gave a talk at this Catholic school and on the problem of evil. And one of the students who was there, who actually didn't hear my talk, but he was a friend of one of the students that heard my talk, he came to me afterwards and he said that, he doesn't believe that there is such a thing as a moral law. And so he doesn't need a moral law giver. And I thought, okay, let's take this for a test run. Let's see what he really believes. And I said, well, what if someone broke into your house? And do you have a mom? He said, yeah. Okay. Do you have a sister? He said, yeah. Okay. Broke into your house, and this individual hurt your mom and dad, or hurt your mom and sister in ways that are unspeakable, and then killed them. Is that wrong? Now he stopped. I mean, he was like, okay, hold on a second, because this is real personal now. And he wanted to say, well, it's wrong for me. Well, I said to him, well, I don't care if it's wrong for you. Is it wrong for that individual? You may not like what he did, but if morality is like ice cream, then some people like chocolate and some people like vanilla. And it does no good to turn to the person who likes vanilla and say, oh, this is horrible. I can't believe you like vanilla. Well, it's just personal preferences at the end of the day. So my point was to expose the evil. All you do in that situation is I'm pointing to the evil thing and saying, that's evil. Don't you agree? And if they say no, then likely a philosophical argument is not going to work. This person may need, and I'm being serious here, psychological help, okay? Just like I have a computer in front of me, and if I wanted to prove that computer existed to you, I would just point at it. I would just say, look, it's right here. Can't you see it? It's an objective feature of the world. In a similar way, I'm going to point to evil things. Now, I can't necessarily point with my fingers, but I'm pointing to something that I hope they can see. This is an objective reality in the world that doesn't depend on my likes or beliefs. So that would be a way to kind of, what I'm doing is I'm trying to get their moral intuitions to rise to the surface and expose a contradiction in what they say and how they actually live their life.
You have such a clear, practical way of, and I think that's just a gift, but in terms of faith and getting you on this trek, what's your story? Who was the person that told you about Jesus or garden or plants? Who was that person in your life or people in your life?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. It was, growing up in a Christian home, we went to a small country church, and there was probably 60 people on a good Sunday. It was one of these churches where after service, if you opened the door and they were spreading manure, we knew because it was there. Here's the thing: this church was not theologically deep, but the relationships and the love these people had for each other was something that I'll never forget. There were times when my parents couldn't afford to put Christmas presents under our tree, and these people made that happen. They bought the presents. There were times when my parents needed a down payment on a house, and the bank wouldn't give it to them. And there was a couple in the church that said, "We got you." I mean, that kind of stuff is the real hands and feet of Jesus Christ. And that is something I can't forget. I can't run from that. I saw the love of Jesus. It wasn't actually until probably university, though, where I really started to take faith seriously. And it was because I was being challenged by atheists and Muslims and Jews at the secular school I went to, York University. And I was studying physics, and they were all, in the science programs. So they started asking me, "Tim, why are you a Christian? Why do you go to church?" And at that time, the best I could do was, I'm a Christian because my parents are Christians. And I knew immediately that was not a good response. It was actually embarrassing. We remember embarrassing, events in our lives, and I'll never forget that event. And so I went home and I started looking into this stuff. I did what most people do. I Googled, and now people YouTube. And I found Christians that could articulate and defend the faith. And I thought, what is this? I'd never heard of apologetics. I never heard of these people who were, famous people like Josh McDowell, kind of in the Christian world. C.S. Lewis, never heard of him. Okay, I got to get Mere Christianity. That's cool. So I started reading this stuff, and I was reading the other side. At that time, Dawkins was really popular. Richard Dawkins, he wrote The God Delusion, and there was some other new atheists at the time, and wanted to see what they had to say. And that's how I got into the whole apologetics world. It kind of came at me, and I found that what I was doing was actually defending the Christian faith. And I actually became a high school science teacher and taught in the public system and the private system. But I was on the side, just for fun, as a hobby, doing apologetic talks, because I didn't want young people to grow up in a church like me that didn't have the intellectual side. I didn't even know there was an intellectual life for the Christian. I just thought it was like, hey, let's do the potlucks, let's do the caroling at Christmas, all that stuff. And so I want our kids to grow up and have both relationship and truth together. And so that's why I started doing it. And I got more and more invitations to the point where it was like, maybe I got to quit my job as a teacher and do this full time. And by God's grace, that's where we're at now. I've been with Stand to Reason for 8 years, and I feel like I'm riding a wave, and I'm trying to stay on the surfboard, and God's making it happen. And Red Pen Logic, same thing. Pandemic hit. I couldn't travel and speak. What am I going to do? Hey, let's give this a try. As a teacher, we'd use the red pen to correct students' work because we cared. And in the same way, I really do care about the people who are being misled by TikToks and Instagram Reels and memes on Twitter. And what I want to do is take that red pen, not because I'm trying to hurt someone or, I'm trying to make someone feel bad. No, I want Christians who are taken in by this to see the errors and actually have a strengthened faith as a result.
Well, let me ask you about some of that good evidence. Maybe just a couple of things that for somebody that is maybe grown up the same way. I knew I grew up a little bit the same way. I mean, there was certainly some knowledge there, but a lot of it was your answer of why you believed what you believed. Well, we just got to go on faith. And it was that interpretation of in Hebrews, it's a blind faith and, things like that. But you have made it so clear, and so many others too, but you do a great job of making it clear. Here's a couple of reasons why we have good evidence on what we believe. For somebody just discovering that, what are a couple of the big ones that you go to on why the Bible is true, why Jesus is who he said he was?
That's good. We got to, right out of the gate, make sure people understand that faith is not blind, okay? And this is like the meme in our culture. Faith is blind. Faith is belief without evidence. That's not true. That's not biblical faith. Biblical faith is active trust based on evidence. It's believing in what you have good reason to believe is true. So even though faith and reason are different things, they're not opposed to each other. In fact, the more reasons I have, the more I trust. Just like, I trust my wife more today than when I married her 15 years ago because she's given me so many reasons to trust her. Okay, that's what it should be like with our Christian faith. So when I initially was struggling with some of those doubts, okay, my parents told me God's real, but they also told me Santa Claus was real, okay? And I found out he wasn't, so maybe God isn't. Okay, so let's start there. Start with like the fundamental beliefs. If if that's where you're at, you don't know whether any of this is true. So I started with God's existence and started looking, are there any good arguments for God? And it turns out, especially in the field that I was studying, which was physics, the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, these things, the origin of life, these point to God as the best explanation Are there other kinds of explanations out there? Sure. What's the best explanation? And I mean, we could go into some of those arguments. And then, I went to, okay, if there's a God, now that's not Christianity. Lots of people believe in God. So what gets you to Christianity? Well, Jesus in particular, his claims to be God and his resurrection. Now, actually, if you can show the resurrection has good historical evidence, well, then that's God vindicating his claims to be God. So you kind of get a 2-for-1 there. You get the central claim of Christianity, which is the resurrection. This is what Paul preached over and over again in the book of Acts. And so we look into what are some of the evidences for the resurrection. Well, it turns out we have good reason to believe that Jesus died on a cross. There's more non-biblical sources on Jesus dying on a cross than biblical sources. By the way, the biblical sources, we call them the Bible, but they're historical texts, okay? That any historian, whether a believer or not, looks at and they say, hey, this is a historical text. We take it seriously. I know a lot of skeptics want to write, well, that's just the Bible. Well, hold on a second. There was a long time when it wasn't under one cover. These were different books. There are letters, there's gospels, there's apocryphal literature. There's all this stuff that was compiled together. We could talk about how that happened and all the rest of it. But these are historical texts. Let's take them seriously. And so you got Jesus' death on a cross, buried by Joseph of Arimathea, empty tomb, and then these appearances. And it's like, okay, how do you make sense of this stuff? And a lot of historians, for most of those, would say, yeah, I agree with all those. But they're going to have other explanations like appearances. Oh, maybe hallucinations. Well, does that make sense? Did they really not know the difference between a hallucination and a real physical bodily appearance? Paul seems to, think about this. Paul was persecuting the church. He was killing Christians. He wanted nothing more than to destroy the church. They were talking about resurrection. He was like, no way. This guy is dead. And then something happens. And he goes proclaiming the resurrection. Well, what happened? Jesus showed up. That's what happened. So how do you explain that? You got to explain Paul's transformation, and just say, well, he was just really grief-stricken or something. It doesn't make sense. So again, best explanation. Of course, with the Bible as a whole, why do we trust the Bible? I mean, I could spend 60 minutes on this, but I believe it is historical eyewitness testimony or written by close acquaintances to the eyewitnesses. And when you read it, it doesn't read like mythology. It reads like true history. This is why, by the way, there's a verse, Luke chapter 3, go look up Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. These are not a part of your devotional time. It's like in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being, and it just goes, tetrarch of Abilene and Lysanias being tetrarch, and it's talking about tetrarchs and different people and places, and you're thinking, why is this in here? It's in there because Paul is grounding what he's talking about in history, in space-time. And that's why at the very beginning of his gospel, he says, many have undertaken to write an account of the things that have happened, but I'm writing these things so you would know with certainty the things that you have been taught. So he's writing this as evidence. Hey, check this historical stuff out for yourself. And look as Christians, we don't get to see Jesus and believe. Like Jesus has never appeared to me. But I do get to read and believe. And that is why the Gospels are there. That is why the New Testament is there. And that's why the Old Testament's there. It's so that we can read about the evidence of what God has done in real history. And then, after assessing the evidence, put our trust in God, put our trust in Jesus Christ.
Something that blew my mind recently, I can't remember who said this, but, virtually every scholar on planet Earth affirms of the three things: that Jesus existed, that Jesus died on a cross, and that Jesus rose again. Those first two, basically everybody, atheist scholars say, yeah, that happened. And somebody made a point that said, but it's interesting, the evidence that we have to show that Jesus existed and died on the cross is the same type of evidence you would prove that he existed after his death, that he appeared after his death. And it's fascinating that for some reason that last one isn't as widely believed when it's the same kind of evidence, attestation. That just kind of, I never even thought about it like that.
But here's the thing. To believe that he rose from the dead is to believe that a miracle has taken place. And a lot of people, so we talked early on about gospicles. These are obstacles to the gospel. And there's lots of questions and challenges out there that we need to respond to. But there's one that often gets put there by the individual themselves, and that is a naturalistic worldview. That is a worldview that says there are no miracles. And that's why there's some people, you know, like Thomas Jefferson, when he read through the Bible, he literally had a pair of scissors and cut out the parts that had to do with the miraculous. Well, why? Because he didn't believe in it. So you have this kind of mindset that says, okay, I will treat the Gospels as historically reliable up to a point. Like, sure, when they talk about Jesus healing this man, this paralytic at the pool of Bethsaida, okay, fine. I will believe that up to the point where he heals him. Like we have historical archaeological evidence that pool exists. You know, we have the external evidence from archaeology that starts to line up with these people and places and all this stuff. Okay, fair enough. But where they stop is the supernatural. And that's, again, because they have imposed a standard that there is no such thing. But if you remove that, if you say, well, I'm going to be open to the supernatural existing. And by the way, if there is a God who can act, there can be acts of God. So that's why I started with, well, let's see if God exists. Because if God does exist, that changes the reality. That changes what's possible. And if there's a God, there can be a resurrection from the dead because God raised Jesus from the dead. So it's a really good point. And we all have to, by the way, all of us need to constantly be thinking about our own biases. I know I got them, and you've got them. Everybody's got them. And sometimes our bias can actually cloud how we see the evidence. And that can happen to any of us, and we just have to be aware of that when we're talking to people.
I've got 3 or 4 more questions. I know we started late.
Sure.
How are we on time? Okay.
Keep going.
All right.
Keep going. Keep going.
So we could talk a lot about the individual accounts and evidence. I'm a super big nerd. There's just a lot to delve into. But when it comes to the balance of logic and faith, does critical thinking rely too much on the human brain? I think a lot of my friends kind of look at me funny when I start getting too into this because at a certain point, like, it is faith, and I don't want to go super even humanistic, dare I say, on this. So what's your balance with that?
Yeah, this is a good question because I don't know if anyone does this perfectly. I know I struggle with it. My tendency is to put a lot of emphasis on reason, okay, and evidence. And I'm more skeptical by nature, okay? Whereas some Christian will say, oh man, God just answered this prayer for me, you know? I want to know, okay, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? What kind of evidence? Was it like the parking spot that you got at Costco? Right. Or are we talking a limb grew back? You know, so I immediately want to know, I got some questions. I'm skeptical, and so I need to develop the spiritual disciplines so that I can trust more, you know, if I can put it that way. Whereas there's some people who, for them, their relationship with Jesus is all love, lovey-dovey. It's all kind of relationship side and very little intellect. And so, and you know what? God bless them. I mean, there are people out there who have a strong faith, a faith that I find it even hard to understand. And they don't know half the things about, you know, the New Testament, how it was put together and all the other stuff. They just don't have that intellectual side. Okay. I think we need a balance, not an anti-intellectualism. We see it in the church. Hey, that logic stuff, that's, you know, not good. You're not putting enough trust in God. And then on the other side, you have these like logic machines, and where's the room for faith? And this is where faith and reason come together. And faith is believing in things it is believing in something that you have good reason to believe is true. So the reasons are going to end up becoming kind of a foundation for my faith. Actually, I think I just finished writing a book on deconstruction, comes out next week, something like that, a week and a half. And one of the things we discovered is when it comes to deconstruction and doubt, oftentimes the individual was raised in the church but didn't have a strong faith foundation. It was like they were walking on thin ice. I'm in Canada here, and you got to be careful. There's ponds and lakes around here, and if the ice isn't thick enough, you will fall through. And that was we played pond hockey all the time growing up. And my mom, she would freak if we didn't get the power drill out there and drill out how many inches. That's what she wants to know. How many inches thick is that ice? Because if it's like half an inch thick, you ain't going out there, okay? So in a similar way, we want to create a sturdy foundation so that when the trials come, we're not falling through that ice. And sadly, it's happened over and over and over again. You see people walking away from the church and their faith. In fact, by the way, this is an aside, Jesus talks about this in the parable of the soils. It's a brilliant parable, but one of the soils is the rocky ground. And it says that some of the seed fell in the rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it springs up initially, but then the sun comes and the plant gets scorched. And then he interprets it. And he says, these are the ones who receive the word with joy. And I think there's lots of kids, man. I get to do sometimes summer camps and stuff. And these are kids that receive the word with joy. But then it says they have no root in themselves and they endure for a while. And then when trials and persecution arise on account of the word, what happens? Yeah. Jesus says they fall away. That's his word. They fall away. So logic and reason and evidence, these have a very important place in the Christian life. It's not the whole thing. There's still trust that needs to occur. But it can provide a great foundation.
We have all heard the critic in our life. It may be that longtime family member or a coworker a lot, you and that God stuff or whatever. And certainly what we see online in this culture. You sincerely, you do a great job of, in your red pen logic and correcting, you do it with such kindness. I never get the vibe from you that you're like, well, let's correct this idiot. You know, it's very kind, even though that's my reaction sometimes, like, that's terrible thinking. I'm so glad it's going to get corrected. What is your approach, or maybe a story and experience where you've been able to have and grow such patience and compassion for even the harshest critics of Christianity?
You know what? When we started Red Pen Logic, I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but it was much more aggressive. And I was more sarcastic. My love language is sarcasm, okay? And I bet there's a lot of people out there who feel the same way, you know? I was putting letter grades, you know, we had the actual pen and we were writing on these things. And I remember showing it to Stand to Reason, my boss, Greg Kokel, who I think is just brilliant at conversations with people. And he's like, Tim, people aren't going to be able to see the ideas because they are fixated on how you're responding to the individual. He said to me, Tim, we respond to ideas, not individuals. And I thought, man, okay, we gotta rethink this. And so that's what I'm working on. I'm not perfect at it. People need to know when they watch a Red Pen Logic video, this is not the first time I watched the video. It's not like I just throw the video up and then record my response. Right. I put time into thinking through what's the main issue and how do I do this quickly, you know, in 2 minutes or less in my response. And of course, I've watched the video now probably 10 or 15 times to kind of understand every word that's going on. So, all the eye rolls and stuff, that's not going to be there, you know, and I don't want anyone to see that because that's not how we should respond. But I'm as human as anybody else, right? And so when I see something that, you know, really gets me angry, you know, my blood boils too. But I think there are some things that we can do. I think that when you're confident in what you know to be true, you don't get hot under the collar. Okay, so we used to have Jehovah's Witnesses come by. It was like a 2-year kind of journey with these 2 elders in the Jehovah's Witness church. And they would come by, they were hugging my kids, like we were like on a first name basis. Yeah. I had their phone number. They would text me before they would come, and we'd often have like 2-hour conversations. In fact, I said, look, you know where I live. I want to know where you live. So I got their address, and I actually went and knocked on their door. It was so, you should have seen the look on their faces, because they had told me, look, how come no one else is doing this? We're the only ones who are knocking on doors. And I said, okay, fair enough. Give me your address. And I knocked on, and we had a great conversation in their living room. But here's the thing. They would come into our living room, and my wife is much more emotional than me. It really balances the two of us out. Okay. So I try to be more like stoic, try to think critically, logic, that kind of thing. Need to work on the compassion side. She is very compassionate, and she models God's love and grace and mercy and all that stuff so well. But when she's challenged, you can tell. Okay. And so we're in the living room, and you could tell, man, she started screaming at these guys. And because they weren't listening and they weren't letting her finish, whatever. And she just lost her cool. And so we had talked about this. And part of the thing was that she wasn't totally confident, I think. And she thought in her mind, I have to win this argument. I have to win this thing. Mm. And in my mind, I don't ever think I have to win an argument anymore. I used to. And I have no problem giving someone the last word. If their last word is, Tim, you're an idiot, okay, you get the last word, I actually think that's a gift in the conversation. And so whenever I can, it's like, okay, I'm not going to respond. You get the last word. Say whatever you want, whether it's an argument, whether it's evidence, whether it's an insult. You got the floor. And so that's part of it too. And then lastly, one of the things that changed how I do evangelism is a book called Tactics. And the book Tactics, written by actually my boss now, Greg Kokel. I loved the book before he became my boss. But he uses questions whenever possible. And he's a master at it. And he talks to all kinds of skeptics, atheists, people of other religions, you name it. And there's something about using questions that just makes you comfortable, because you're asking the question and you just sit back and listen. That's your job. And then you hear something that you have another question about, you ask another question. And when you do that, you can actually put a stone in someone's shoe. And that's our goal. My goal in every conversation is not for that person to receive Christ. I mean, that's an ultimate kind of goal. I would love that person to come to Christ. But in a specific conversation that I'm having, like with the Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm just putting a stone in your shoe. That's my only goal. And so I don't feel disappointed if that person hasn't said a prayer before they leave. You know what I'm saying? So all of that together calms me down. So I can just, okay, God, I'm going to use the next 2 minutes to glorify you. And if they don't receive it, that's not on me. That's on them. If they don't agree, they don't agree. Fair enough. And so that's just, and then the humility. Again, I'm not the most humble person, but I'm doing my best to say, you know what, I could be wrong. And maybe I need to think about that. And so in every conversation, man, if I'm talking to someone, I can't tell you how many times someone has made a comment and I'm like, oh man, I haven't thought about that. That's a really good point. Let me think about it. And by the way, that's my exit out of the conversation. Because now I'm going to take what they've said, and when the pressure's off, I'm going to research. I'm going to think about it. So I think all those things together will help our listeners here to just chill, okay? We're just going to chill when we're having these very oftentimes controversial or heated topics. People watch Red Pen, they see me respond to pro-choicers on abortion. They see me respond to LGBT, pastors. All these guys, and oftentimes they're shouting and using, language and whatever. And I want to be the contrast. Here's how you can respond in just a way that's totally chill.
I love that. And that's full circle on the Jehovah's Witnesses. I heard one the other day of Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on a guy's door, and he said, "Yeah, come on in." And they sit down on the couch, and he says, "Okay, so what you got?" And they go, "We don't know. We never made it this far." So the idea that people are actually letting them in, that's absolutely incredible. I think just a couple more things on people that often I think the biggest struggle that most of us have in sharing faith is our friends that just don't really care. They're not going to have these intellectual debates. They just, yeah, okay, whatever you believe is fine with what you believe. But I have a friend that says I believe in myself because he's very career driven, and even people that go, yeah, there's probably something higher, but then they don't seem to look into it. Like, shouldn't be the biggest deal?
Yeah.
You've labeled them apatheists, and I love that word because it's so true. But what's your take on how to reach somebody that just doesn't care?
So I didn't invent the word apatheism. I read it somewhere on some blog and thought, this is it. As I travel around teaching and speaking, I would say that the biggest concern isn't atheism, it's apatheism, especially with young people. So atheism is the belief that God does not exist, okay? Apatheism is the belief that I don't care if God exists. I'm just apathetic to it. And I actually think that this is one of our struggles, in getting people to care about the things that matter most, like the gospel and how to defend it. So one of the approaches that we use at Stand to Reason is we'll often, to get kids to care, we beat them up. Now let me clarify. What we do is we often get invited in as an atheist. So the youth pastor would introduce me. Hey, here's my buddy, Tim Barnett. We grew up together and went to school, and he now no longer believes. And we just want him to share so you guys get another perspective. And I have a full presentation that I give articulating the atheist worldview and the arguments against Christianity. In fact, I did this, last week in Minnesota. And one of the kids in the front row, a grade 8 student, said, "You were a very convincing atheist." Okay? And it's just interesting because these kids, sometimes they know I'm a Christian. Most of the time they don't. I put on like little glasses. And basically when I'm wearing the glasses, those are my atheist glasses. My girls at home here, they know if I got those on, we're doing a role play. And, because I want them to think for themselves and I want them to hear the challenges. And oftentimes when our back's against the wall, that's when we start to take our faith seriously. That's how it happened for me. It was at the Stacy Library at York University, the science library. That's where I was challenged. That's when my back was against the wall. That got me to think. That got me motivated. I'm trying to create that environment in a local church. So that's one way. But here's the thing. If you just walk up to an apathetic student and start giving evidence for Christianity, they likely won't respond right. They don't care. That's because they're apathetic. Yeah. So one of the other things you can do besides, beating them up with the role play is just to model the love of Jesus to them. Okay. So you want them to see maybe the truth aspect of it is not where you want to live. You want to live so you don't want to live in the propositions. You want to live out the person of Jesus. Jesus didn't just say the truth. He was the truth. So how do we kind of live that out? And my hope would be that people would see your life and how it's different from the rest of the world. And when they do that, they ask the questions. Hey, why are you so different? By the way, 1 Peter 3:15, the classic verse that we use for apologetics, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that's in you, but do this with gentleness and respect. The context of that is suffering persecution. The church in 1 Peter is suffering. And in that moment, people are going to see you don't suffer like everybody else does. What's going on there? What is the reason for your hope? You are suffering, but you're hopeful. What's going on there? And that's why they're asking the question. That's what we want. We want people to see us filled with hope, even when things aren't going our way, even when we're maligned or taken advantage of, even when someone sends a hateful comment on, YouTube or whatever. We want to show there's a reason for our hope, and hopefully people start asking the question. So that would be part of it. The last thing is, you can't make people care. So don't carry that burden on your shoulders. If you've got a son or daughter, if you've got a friend, and they don't care, you likely can't make them. Okay. Even though we try with the atheist role play, there's some kids it just doesn't register. It's like, man, they're just going to shrug their shoulders. Yeah. And so there's not much you can do in that situation.
Yeah. Man, this is so good. I so appreciate this. We could talk for hours. But tell me the name of the book again. I know it's you and Elisa Childers with this, right?
That's right. So Elisa Childers, who was formerly of Zoe Girl, an old, Christian girls pop band. The two of us partnered. I had been doing a lot of research on deconstruction a few years ago for a camp that I spoke at. And as I was sitting at the back of this old, chapel, one of the evenings, I sent her a message because I saw the connection between deconstruction and progressive Christianity. And she had written a book called Another Gospel. And it's basically a case against progressive Christianity. And I said, you need to write a book on deconstruction. And she said, Tim, I'm so busy. I'm currently working on a different book. And so I said, well, do you want to write it together? And she said, let's talk. And I thought, this is awesome, So we spent a year researching this book. It looks at this phenomenon that people are calling deconstruction, and we want to show people what it truly is. It's not merely asking questions, okay? It's not a synonym for questions. Although some people are using it that way, there is something much more insidious going on, especially online. And so if you type in #deconstruction, you'll be teleported into a world that it's hard to even imagine that this place exists. Okay. I'm just saying, if you're a Christian and you're not familiar with this stuff, that's where you're going if you type in #deconstruction. So we show what it is, why it's dangerous, and how to respond to it. We want to fill people in the church who know someone who is deconstructed. They have a loved one who's deconstructed. We want to fill them with hope and really practical advice. And that's what you're going to get if you pick up the book.